Hello and welcome to Media7. I'm Russell Brown. The deadly nature of the conflict in Afghanistan crashed back into the headlines this week after a Taliban suicide bomber struck a NATO convoy in Kabul, killing 6 US troops and a dozen Afghan civilians. There was also a flurry of headlines of another kind earlier this month, thanks to a short trip to the country by our Prime Minister and 4 journalists chosen by his staff. In this program, we'll ponder the use of Prime Ministerial press trips and speak to a New Zealander who has been reporting from New Zealand's forgotten war for more than 8 years. But first, Jose Barbosa looks behind the flak jacket.
Oh my God. When I was just a mop-head youngster, I'd play at war with my action figures. People often lament the loss of their capacity to play or to make believe. But I bet I could think of one grown-up who still likes to play dress-up. A smart leader never discounts the value of a good costume. Patton, immortalised here in film by George C. Scott, was arguably the master of power dressing, even if he did look like the lord of the sampler box.
All real Americans love the sting of battle.
Nowadays, nothing says I'm on top of things more than camo dungarees and flak jackets. Except, of course, when one appears to be making policy on the hoof. At the beginning of John Key's recent trip to Kabul, there seemed a good chance the SAS would be coming home.
Well, the SAS preference would be to have a smaller contingent to stay for a bit longer. Whether that meets favour with us is something we'd need to consider.
Yet by the end of the trip, he'd committed the Defence Force to another 5 years in Afghanistan.
There's certainly going to be a presence here for quite a long time into the future. The makeup of that presence will change, and you will see a reduction of the military capability here and an increase of the civilian capability.
In fact, Key spent his time looking much like a ready-to-please head boy, posing for photos for the school magazine. But then it seems like you can cajole our Prime Minister into doing anything.
The bloody Red Baron was flying once more.
But this head boy was just the latest Prime Minister, who's been part of the push to prop up President Hamid Karzai, who last week was summoned to Washington to receive a ticking off about corruption. Politicians aren't the only ones who like a good fancy dress free-for-all. Journalists also come to the party. Guy Espiner and Duncan Gunner, hand-picked by the Prime Minister's office, took the costume notes to heart. Like John Key, the idea was to impart a sense of danger. So their stories were as much about military paraphernalia as they were about Afghanistan.
Having arrived at the airbase, we are taken in armoured vehicles into the centre of Kabul.
Well, it was more like a Toyota, but I guess double-weave upholstery could be considered a type of armour. Now steady on, Jose, I can hear you saying at home. Cut them some slack, they're reporting in a war zone, you big sack of condensed milk. Yes, Afghanistan isn't the safest place, but as Duncan Garner pointed out, they weren't going anywhere near the real trouble spots.
The Kiwi soldiers reckon this is one of the more safer spots. One said it was a bit like Queenstown.
Yet he was still happy to muck about on a rooftop dressed like a police punching bag. And if Key was falling into line behind the US...
I indicated the value and how much we appreciate the professionalism and effectiveness of the force.
So the journalists were soaking up Key's every word.
So I'm not prepared to send people to a destination I'm not prepared to come myself.
Perhaps the real shame here is that neither TV1 nor TV3 found it necessary to get their reporters to interview even one Afghan. Instead, the people who this conflict is really about became the wallpaper in their own story. The faceless backdrop in a child's war game, driven by the powerful and the tone-deaf.
With me now is John Stevenson, whose 8.5-year record of visiting the region has been light on photo ops but long on journalism. I'll be speaking with him for the rest of the show. Welcome, John.
Thanks.
Now, you're freshly back from Afghanistan. Tell me about this trip.
Well, it was a very interesting trip because I covered the war initially in 2001, and it was very interesting to see the progress or lack thereof. Quite a disturbing trip, really, from the point of view of just how much trauma, just how much pain and suffering is being experienced by the Afghan people.
Why do you work the way you do? Why is it so important for you to be there?
Well, two separate questions, but if I take the latter one first, it's important, I think, because New Zealand needs to have someone bearing witness to the sorts of things that are happening in Afghanistan. Why do I work the way I do? Well, I think dressing like a local, travelling with the locals is far more effective and far safer than wandering around looking, as Jose said, like a police punching bag. Wearing a flak jacket would just make me a bigger target. So.
Well, actually, perhaps we could have a look at that. There we are. There you are on screen. You've got, you look very much like a local. Is that part of the key of doing this?
Well, I mean, you know, believe it or not, cross-dressing isn't the main reason why I go to Afghanistan, but it's an effective way of blending in because, you know, if you're wearing Western clothes and dressing like a CNN journalist on the rooftop in Kabul, it puts you in danger. It makes it much easier for you to be spotted, much easier for you to be kidnapped, and you can't really do much reporting if you're sitting learning Pashto with very bearded and smelly people somewhere in Helmand province.
So wearing a flak jacket is akin to saying, shoot me.
Well, it's advertising your presence, and people aren't going to want to open up to you if you look like you're a member of the military or you know, some NGO person. You're much more likely to get open, free, frank conversations if you're travelling with locals, if you win their trust, and you know, you're not travelling in a way that sort of resembles a military convoy.
What did you make of the kind of coverage we got from the Prime Minister's visit?
Well, I was in Afghanistan when it was run, and to be fair, I didn't see all of it, but what I saw of it was disappointing. It's probably the most euphemistic way I could put it. Lamentable, disgraceful even. I think if you accept that the role of the journalist is to monitor the systems of power, monitor power, as the Israeli journalist Amira Haas puts it, I think you'd agree that what resulted from that trip was more like stenography to the powerful rather than holding their feet to the fire.
Now, the other thing that you did there was a poll of the residents of Bamiyan. Which you know, you did 100 interviews for it, which is 100 more interviews than the 4 visiting journalists did. Perhaps we could go through some of the questions because I thought the results were very interesting.
Sure. Question
1 was, how do you rate the contribution of the New Zealand Provincial Reconstruction Team to the security of Bamiyan Province? Nearly 2/3 saying, yeah, we feel more secure, which is interesting because in theory that's not what the PRT's there for.
Well, I guess I should point out that I'm a reporter and I would be loath to interpret what the people of Bamiyan said, but I think it's fairly safe to read into those answers that they're happy with the security side of their work, not so happy with their work towards reconstruction. And I think it's important that to say that the people of Bamiyan reported that while the contribution to security was good, there's only 120, 140 New Zealanders there, and their point is that Bamiyan historically has been very adversarial towards the Taliban. They were persecuted by the Taliban, the Shia Muslims, Hazara people, and security has never been an issue in the sense that the vast bulk of the people of Bamiyan province do not want the Taliban there. They're on the side. So we started with an advantage. So their view is that, you know, security was a given in the sense that no one's going to try and welcome back the Taliban. I mean, they were tortured, they were beheaded. You know, no one was keen for that to happen again. And the idea that, I think I read in someone's blog, I think it was Duncan Garner's blog, that if the Provincial Reconstruction Team were to leave Bamiyan, that the Taliban would be back like that is just absolute nonsense. Any idea that 120 New Zealanders are holding back the Taliban tide from, you know, entering Bamiyan is pure farce.
Question 2, what do you make of the contribution to the reconstruction? 44% saying a poor job. That's interesting because what we've been told back here is that our troops are doing worthwhile work.
Yeah, I think if you added together the unhappy and very unhappy, it was 2/3 were either very unhappy or unhappy. And that certainly, to my mind, ran counter to the spin that's been put out by the New Zealand Defence Force. Now, I think it's important, Garth George was very upset about this and described the poll as a deliberate attempt or premeditated attempt to belittle the work of our brave soldiers. It wasn't that at all. It's not a commentary on the work of the soldiers. It's the people expressing their view that the reconstruction isn't proceeding at the pace that they would feel is appropriate.
Now, the other, while we're talking about Garth George, because he did deliver a lacerating column on your work, he said that, well, you know, of course you're not going to get proper results because you've only picked people from the centre of Bamiyan and this is a complete nonsense. But I get the impression that you tried a little bit harder to get a reasonable sample than that. Yes,
I mean, I don't know if you take Garth George seriously, I don't, but let's, as an intellectual exercise for a moment, let's just look at some of his comments. I mean, you know, I would have loved to spend a month or two climbing the mountains to interview 8 people in a yak, but it was obviously much more expeditious to interview people in and around the main population centre, which was Bamiyan Township. And we interviewed people from about 12 different locations, and a huge range of people, from female students to shopkeepers to doctors to...
And you did interview women. I mean, was that an issue? Was that difficult to do?
It was an issue, and I Garth will sort of quake in his boots to know that I was doing my best to actually do a fair poll here. What I did was I actually employed a female university lecturer to translate the questions and interview women, because I obviously couldn't do that by myself with a male translator. So, this was an attempt to do a Colmar-Brunton poll. I couldn't ring 1,000 people in Bamiyan, mainly because most of them don't have phones. But what it was an attempt to do was to get some sense of how people feel about the work of our troops on the ground. And we haven't had any independent reporting on that since they've been there.
Indeed. Let's move on to question 3. Back on the uptick, how do you feel about the way New Zealand troops treat the people of Bamiyan province? Either very happy, 83% either very happy or happy. That does meet with our expectation that our troops treat people well, doesn't it? It
does, and I personally, as a Kiwi, I was delighted to know that we are treating the people there with respect and decency, which is something that can't be said of some of the other coalition forces. I would have thought that the Defence Force and Garth George would have taken note of that. If you're a party to a premeditated attempt to belittle the Defence Force, either I'm incompetent as well as biased, because half the answers were favourable to the Defence Force, so obviously the Taliban didn't pay me enough to skew the results. But I would have been happy with that if I were them.
And finally, question 4: do you feel that you or your family has benefited in any way from the aid projects in which the PRT's been involved? Again, 2/3 thought no. Perhaps not surprising. You can't reach everyone, can you?
Well, Garth George compared it to asking beneficiaries whether they had enough money. Personally, I think we were party to what many consider to be an illegal invasion of Afghanistan, certainly party to the ongoing occupation of the country. The idea that the people of Afghanistan, and Bamiyan in particular, cannot express freedom of speech after 8.5 years of occupation, I wouldn't care whether their answers were positive or negative. They're entitled to have their say without being attacked and without the journalists being accused of high treason.
Nonetheless, I get the impression that work like this that you've been doing does get up the nose of the New Zealand Defence Force. Would that be fair?
I think it gets up the nose of some people in the Defence Force. You've got to remember that a lot of the sources that I have for stories are from the Defence Force, and it's important to say what everyone I think in New Zealand instinctively knows, that there is a tremendous number of honourable, hard-working, decent people in the Defence Force. As for some of the people at the top of the tree, as for some of the policy with respect to our involvement in Afghanistan, I would say that's a very different story. And the people who are behind that policy have a vested interest in New Zealanders not knowing about it, or the journalists who are doing it being discredited.
So you have been able to speak to our troops over there?
I didn't speak to them on this trip. I saw them. Well, at least I saw some members of the SAS, but I didn't see anyone. And I didn't see one New Zealand troop all the time I was in Bamiyan.
Do you get the impression that Defence Command would like to stop that happening? They would like to prevent you speaking to soldiers?
Of course, they've tried.
Why?
Because they like to control the media and they like to control the spin. They have a lot of people working very hard to do that. I had a letter sent to my newspaper claiming that I hadn't, or certainly suggesting that I hadn't visited the SAS headquarters as I had reported in one of my stories. It was just completely untrue, the claims that were made. And one of the claims was that he didn't sign the visitor's book, so obviously he hadn't gone there. Well, believe it or not, that wasn't the first thing I did when I went in, was sign a visitor's book. I could have published detailed information that would have made it very clear that I'd been there, including names of the SAS troops on the base. But that would have exposed me to howls of outrage. You're stuffed either way. I try to do the best I can to be fair, to be accurate, to act in the public interest without prejudicing the safety of the troops. And obviously I don't please everyone.
We'll pause now and return with more on Afghanistan, the press and politics after the break.